Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on the time zone where you are. I want to welcome you all to this high-level discussion on measuring the sustainability of tourism. It's so good that so many people have registered for this event, more than 500, and it's also live streamed on YouTube. And this is an advantage that we have. Obviously, we would all want to sit in a room in New York and really meet each other. But organizing this event in this way makes it possible for so many people from all over the world to attend. My name is Bert Kroeze. I'm Deputy Director General of Statistics Netherlands, and I'm chair of the UNCEA, the UN committee that's responsible for developing and implementing the system of environmental economic accounts. And this is a statistical standard that makes it possible to describe this relationship. And statistical standards are important. They make it possible as a common language for all stakeholders to ensure things are measured in a well-defined way and that the results are comparable internationally. And data, comparable data about the relationship between the economy and the environment is essential. Too long, the relationship has been ignored, and in all economic analysis, the dependencies on and the impact on the environment have not been taken into account. So today's event is about the sustainability of tourism and measuring that. While the importance of the topic of tourism cannot be understated, there has been enormous growth the last decades in tourism, and obviously it's important for many countries, for people. And it also has an impact on the environment, an impact on the population, on the regional economies. It has an impact on social heritage, cultural heritage. And it's important to know that relationship, to know that dependency. And in order to make policy measures on it, you need to have data to describe that relationship. And standards are important to make the data in a good way. So it's very good to know that a lot of work has been done on a statistical framework for measuring sustainability of tourism. Well, this framework will be introduced by Mr. Hernan Epstein later on this afternoon. So from my experience in the UNCEA, it's incredibly important to work together, to not do it alone as a statistical community. You need to reach out to the policymakers. We need to know the people that we make these data, these standards for. So interaction is so important that we do the things that are really useful to make policies for. And it's not only important to reach out to the policymakers to work together, but also to the academic world, to the private world, only a joint effort, and essentially also to the public. So working together in an inclusive approach is important. That's why I'm so happy that today's event has such a broad approach. We start with a session giving the different perspectives on the measurement of sustainable tourism. Perspectives from the statistical world, from the policy world, and the private world. And we have 4 short interventions that explain that a bit more. After that, we have 1 hour of country experiences. We hear interesting experiences in Jamaica, in Mexico, in the Philippines, and Austria. What has been done there, what could be done, what is successful. And we end with introduction to this statistical framework for measuring sustainability of tourism developed by the UNWTO. So at the end, we hope to have 15 minutes for question and answers. So your inputs are very much welcome. There's at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. You can click that and put your questions and remarks on it. And there are some people in the background who pick the questions that we can put on the table, and hopefully we have time for that. So during the session, there's no room for questions and comments, but in the end, we can take them, and we're very happy to take them if you put them in the Q&A box. So basically, that's my introduction. Very looking forward to this event. And we start with the first of the 3 parts of today's high-level discussion, and that's on the policy, private sector, and statistical perspectives. And we start with Mr. Tobias Thomas. Mr. Tobias Thomas is Director General of Statistics Austria. On the website, there is CV of all the speakers of today, so I'll just introduce them very shortly. What I just want to add to this is that Mr. Thomas is adjunct professor of economics at Heinrich Heine University in Düsseldorf, as well as CMDS fellow at the Central European University in Budapest. So, Mr. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I feel very honored to be part of this high-level discussion on measuring the sustainability of tourism. In my position as Director General of Statistics Austria, I focus on the entire universe of official statistics. However, according to the UN Agenda 2030 sustainability, and in particular the sustainability of the tourism, is without any doubt of outstanding importance. This is not only, but notably true for countries in which the tourism represents a very high share of the economy, such as in Austria. So how can official statistics and the measurement of sustainability of tourism contribute to the challenges of today and the future? Please allow to start with some general thoughts. From my perspective, we are living in a world which, despite of huge progress in the economic development of many countries in the last decades, the world is facing rising uncertainty, for instance, in course of the current corona crisis, and with a tendency of fake news and rising populism. For instance, the rise of the internet and social media caused, on one hand, that information can be shared and consumed at marginal costs of zero. This did leverage the informational freedom of many people in the world and can be a driver of further progress. On the other hand, fake news and so-called alternative facts can be spread easily as well. In this situation, from my perspective, the national statistical institutes, as well as supranational organizations like the UN, play a crucial role in providing credible information. Credible information for the public, for a fact-based public debate, information to companies, governments, and public administrations for evidence-based decisions, and to the scientific community to do empirical research on many topics. In addition, reliable numbers, in particular those which are comparable across countries, can be a source and a driver of reforms and innovations. The measurement of the UN SDG indicators is a role model in this context, with an outstanding impact on the efforts to tackle the economic, social, and environmental challenges of today and the future. Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, tourism is not only an important economic factor in Austria, it is an integral part of the economic, social, and environmental system. Our policymakers are aware of this and do know the importance of reliable numbers and an evidence-based approach. Hence, in the field of tourism, Statistics Austria works closely together in an ongoing good partnership with our user community representing companies, politics, and administrations. One concrete example for this fruitful partnership is the Austrian Tourism Master Plan, which my colleague Jürgen Weiss will present later to you in the second part of our meeting on behalf of Peter Leimer. In measuring the sustainability of tourism, we see an important factor and driver to rebuild the tourism sector to ensure tourism regains its position as a provider of decent jobs, stable incomes, and the protection of our cultural and natural heritage, to quote our distinguished UN General Secretary Antonio Guterres. This is in particular true in times of the corona crisis. COVID-19 did bring global tourism to a standstill, which is affecting economies around the world heavily. However, there will be a time after the corona crisis. We will travel again and we will experience the resurgence of tourism. In this course, there hopefully is the inherent chance, beside all negative current effects of the corona crisis, that we can use the crisis as the starting point of a new age of tourism and traveling. Hence, a comprehensive measurement of tourism and its sustainability is of outstanding importance. The joint recovery of tourism should align a resilience policy and new business models with new measures, since any expansion of the tourism industry will affect not only the economic and social development, but the environment as well. However, at least in the long term, there exists an inherent incentive for the tourism industry to pursue environmental sustainability, as environmental damages can negatively affect touristic demand as well. To measure and monitor the development towards sustainable tourism, some factors are, from my perspective, of particular importance. Firstly, we need a good definition and understanding of sustainable tourism. Secondly, we need to find good indicators to measure the status quo as well as the dynamics of environmental sustainability in the context of tourism. Thirdly, we need to find ways to separate the impact of tourism on the environmental sustainability from other factors which are affecting the environment as well. And fourthly, we need to measure the indirect effects of tourism as well. In addition, it has to be considered that the capacity to achieve cross-country harmonization of sustainable tourism measures will be limited due to the big variety of the environmental situations and of the tourism services in the different regions of the world. And the importance of new data sources in order to produce indicators for sustainable tourism will rise, as a willingness to respond to surveys as well as the information content of the surveys themselves will be limited in the future. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. It's so good to hear that there's really a need for reliable numbers on this integral approach to the economy, environment, and society. And I think many people will agree that after COVID, there's a new age of traveling, and we will see how we can have this comprehensive policies and comprehensive measurement is there. And a word of warning that it might be difficult to standardize because of the differences in circumstances and tourism environment. Thank you for this statistical perspective. The next person on the panel is Mr. Julio Lopez Astor. And he is Assistant Director General, Subdirectorate General for Tourism Knowledge and Research, Ministry of Industry, Commerce and Tourism in Spain. And we will hear, I think, from the policy perspective now. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Kress. Thank you. I want to thank especially the UNWTO Department of Statistics and the United Nations Statistics Division for hosting this event. I think it's crucial. You probably all heard this say that you don't value things that you have until you lose them. And for the last year, we have lost the ability, the freedom to travel around. We have lost the freedom to discover new places, to visit our families and friends, to go hike in the mountains. And we have realized that with this loss comes that tourism creates a lot of good, that tourism can be a vector of good. And but we cannot forget also that although tourism brings the possibility of creating good jobs and bring income to sustain the protection of the environment, it can also create disturbances. It can be a force of disruption in terms of the environment and the local communities, the local societies. We all have seen the queues, the long lines at the top of the Everest or the Machu Picchu. We've seen the crowds in places like Venice or Dubrovnik or Barcelona. And now that we have for a while been not able to travel, it is a really an excellent occasion to restart and reset. And make no mistake, tourism will come back. There's already a pent-up demand. We can sense it with all. Every time there's any good news regarding vaccines or regarding tourism corridors, the travel searches shut up immediately. So there's a lot of people wanting to travel again. And tourism has been a resilient sector. It has gone through many crises in the past, economic crisis, terrorism, wars, and it has always recovered. So there is I think tourism nowadays in 21st century is actually a basic human need. So it will happen. Now, we need to make sure that when we recover the tourism flows, that this will be according to sustainable standards, that this tourism flows will not only contribute to the economic of the country receiving these flows, but also that will be accepted by the local communities and that will be not disturbing to the environment. So therefore, we need to make sure we have the right indicators, that these are feasible and that these are meaningful. Because if we're driving a car blindfolded, we are not going to get where we want to get. We need to know that the policy that we are implemented is having its effect or not. We need to be able to correct course as soon as possible. And we cannot do this if we don't have the right measures. It's not enough to just be able to know how much of your GDP is provided by tourism. It's good to know that, but it's not enough. We need to know also what effect tourism is having on the local population and what effect it's having on the environment. So my appeal here is very simple. We need to make sure that we are aware that this is crucial. It's not just not just another statistical framework. That's the MST, the framework that the UNWTO is building up with the help of many countries, is essential for the policy. That if you don't have the right feedback, you are not going to be able to design a policy that has success in the long term. You're just guessing. And well, in the statistical community, everyone knows that you guess a little bit, but you try not to guess a lot. And therefore, I really commend the UNWTO for putting together this effort of having a statistical framework for measuring the sustainability of tourism. And I want to thank also members of the statistical committee, the Committee on Statistics in the UNWTO that I have the honor of co-chairing, and the working group on the MST that my colleague Peter Leimer chairs. I think that we all should support their work, and that it should have a very important weight in the decision making of the statistical community in the future. I thank you all for the opportunity to deliver this message. It's not a technical message, it's just an appeal from the side of the policy. We need to have feasible and meaningful statistics to let us know if we're doing right or not. Thank you.
Thank you for your very inspiring speech. And we didn't expect a technical speech. We expected especially something like you said, that from the policy perspective, you really need this data that can be used to see whether things are doing well or not. And you indicated that it's important to have this this new start where the impact on the economy and the society and environment can be measured in the same way. So for us, it's very important, for us statisticians, that you say these things, because we want to do something that's meaningful, and we do it for policymakers. So it's very important what you said. Thank you. The next speaker on my list is Mr. Pedro Moreira. He's advisor to the Ministry of Tourism and Transport in Cabo Verde. So, Mr. Moreira, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe you guys are listening well. Dear colleagues in the panel, hello everybody around the world participate in this event. Hello fellows from the Africa Commission of UNWTO. Good morning, good afternoon to everybody. First of all, it's a great pleasure and an honor to be part of this high-level discussion on measuring the sustainability of tourism. On behalf of the Minister of Tourism and Transport from Cabo Verde, as some of you know, a small country, an African country, and be able to share with you guys a bit what we have been doing regarding this topic of this event. For some of you, in spite of some of homework probably done, let me start by briefly presenting Cabo Verde, because differently from many countries, Cabo Verde is not that known in the world. Cabo Verde, or Republic of Cabo Verde, is an island nation or an archipelago in the Atlantic Ocean, in the northwestern coast of Africa, about 600 kilometers west of Senegal. The archipelago is divided in two main island groups. We have a total of 10 islands. Combined land area is about 4,000 square kilometers. Don't laugh, please. Which is about, let's say, one and a half times the size of Luxembourg. Probably slightly larger than the size of Rhode Island in the US. The population is about 550,000 people in the country, although we have, let's say, about 2 million of Cape Verdeans abroad in Europe and the United States. To say to you that tourism is a quite recent phenomenon in Cabo Verde, although it has been growing very rapidly. Just to have an idea, in 2000, we used to have about 145,000 tourists in the country, and 15 years later, we have 10 times that amount. So tourism contributes to about 25% of GDP and represents more than 10% of jobs in Cabo Verde. Although, as you guys probably know, we have big challenges regarding our tourism. First of all, let's say about what we call a triple concentration and dependency. 70% of our source market come from Europe, from 2, 3, 4 countries. And 80% of tourists goes to just to 2 islands, so we have 10. And when you say 2 islands, you say the same products in these 2 islands. One very important figure for all of you that are listening to this about Cabo Verde, 91% of our FDI goes to tourism. 91% of our FDI go to tourism. Regarding the topic of today, let me just 3 or 4 topics because I don't have much time to talk about this. For a country like Cabo Verde, a small island developing states, sustainability and tourism sustainability is becoming of utmost importance. However, in order to have the right policy and the regulations in place and in due time, it's not enough to have only the statistical data and information economic perspective, which is important, we know. One needs also to be able to measure the social, the environmental, and other data from and within the tourism industry. In addition, taking account all we have learned during this and with this pandemic, probably never in the history of tourism, we have all agreed on the need to make tourism sustainable. Indeed, one primary goal of our government is to ensure that tourism keeps within the margins of our fragile ecosystems and that economic growth spreads to the poorest sectors of the population. In this sense, the government wants to maximize the beneficial effects of this growing sector with appropriately planning and controlling tools which take us to the measuring and evaluating. In the last years, many initiatives have been developed ranging from accelerating and supporting the elaboration of land use ordinance, protecting areas, managing areas, guidance and integration on economic development, plans to increase the share of ecotourism, and bring to the table well-managed nature-based tourism in the country. Right now, we are implementing what we call our tourism recovery program, which is baptized Rebirth of Tourism. And one of our 4 sub-programs of this program is the tourism sustainability. based on a project we call Tourism Sustainability Deal. Unfortunately, the project was almost ready to start when it was suspended due to COVID-19, but we plan to resume it as soon as possible. And the measurement of sustainability will be the item to be focused and discussed and included in the project, because it was not in there in the very initial of the program. I believe I'll stay by ear and will be available for any discussion or any question you guys might have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Moreira. Again, it's good to hear that there's a large interest in statistics, not only about tourism, but on the relationship between tourism, the economy, society, and environment. There's a real interest to work on that, a policy interest to make tourism sustainable and the data needs for that. So again, this is important for us statisticians to know that we're doing the right thing, and we have to interact with people from policy responsible for driving these policies to find out we're doing the right thing. So thanks for your introduction. The last introduction in this block of speeches is by Mr. Tim Fairhurst. He's Secretary General of the European Tourism Association, and he's probably able to give some insight also from the private sector. So Mr. Fairhurst, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, fellow panelists, and hello to everybody who is following along online. Very happy to be here, and thank you very much to the UNWTO for getting me involved in this. It's so important we get tourism at the top of the policy list. When times were good, when it was no problem, people just came. Tourism didn't need as much government attention. Now it does. And it can't get proper government attention without good data. So this is a very timely event. Thank you very much for involving ETOA in this. ETOA, or the European Tourism Association, is a trade association. All of its members have one thing in common. They're interested in the tourism that takes place in Europe. They may be buyers based in China, Japan, the United States, or indeed inside Europe, and they're the supply chain as well within Europe, and many destination management organizations at a local, regional and national level. So hopefully I've got a reasonably good insight into some of the discussion and certainly some of the applications of data as regards tourism that takes place in Europe. And in some ways, as I was preparing for this, I was reflecting that Europe is a good laboratory for the global statistics community insofar as they're paying attention to tourism, because tourism has been going on here for a very long time at scale. So if we can get tourism right in Europe, and if we can learn from the mistakes we've made in Europe, then we've got a better chance of taking those learnings so that tourism really can support sustainable development in the rest of the world. So don't copy our mistakes, do copy the good stuff, and hopefully we can learn from each other. And I'll split my remarks just into 3 time periods. One is pre-COVID, and obviously in Europe, one of the main focuses of any discussion about sustainability was the famous and very overused word over-tourism, and sustainability itself became stretched to mean whatever the speaker wanted it to mean. Less vocal, perhaps, were all the destinations who really could use a bit more benefit from the visitor economy, but they didn't really have that voice. So I'm really here to say that measuring travel and tourism does need more attention. And without buying at a national level, so without national data that is comparable, benchmarkable, transparent, comprehensive, trusted, we're not going to get the change we need at a government level. So in a way, I'm here to ask for help. A year ago, roughly, a bit less, I was together with all kinds of partners in the industry in Europe, having meetings with the European Commission saying, what has happened? What will happen? How many people are affected? What will the cost be? What's the investment loss? It was very notable how hard it was to get the numbers, and it still is. And it's very odd if you think about it. I think I'm right in saying in Germany, tourism or the visitor economy supports about 3 million jobs before COVID hit. The automotive industry supports around about 800,000. Now, those automotive industry jobs probably pay more on average, but one of the great things about the visitor economy is it returns jobs to the economy faster than anyone else, but it also gives jobs to a very wide range of people of all educational accomplishments, age, and so on. It's a really useful job generator. We need to look after it. There was some good news in all of that, and it was a realization that tourism needs better integration into government. You cannot separate it. You cannot have it off to the side as a nice thing to have, and you don't need to worry too much. It will come. Europe is old, it's beautiful, it's fascinating, it's cultural. People will keep coming. Perhaps not, and they do have options worldwide. So better management is necessary. And when I've talked to, or listened rather, to experts from the market intelligence community, from the tourism research experts, what I've heard them talk about increasingly in the last years is big data. And you know all about it. It's airline and GDS data, it's credit card information, it's mobile phones, it's internet, it's social listening. None of that is national data. And isn't that interesting? So from a management point of view, none of that is being collected at a national level. Whereas if we want tourism to be one of the most effective engines we have for sustainable recovery, we really do need that joined up strategy, and that has to be stitched together at a national level. So very quickly, in a minute or so, what's better tourism look like? You know, what's good in 2030, and what will we be measuring to know we've got there? And that's the challenge to the colleagues from the World of Statistics today. And I'm just going to focus on one thing, and that's environmental impact, and within that, climate, because we do have some numbers. One of them is 1.5 degrees, and we do not want to go much further than that. We also know that carbon emissions are the single biggest impact to controlling global temperature increase. So measurement of carbon is the single biggest thing we can get right at a national level. So that means comparability. In reference to what was said earlier, I think Tobias, harmonization is probably the thing we can do with carbon, because we can get some agreement around pricing, particularly around flights. How does this work? How are you measuring the footprint? There has to be comparability and transparency and no double counting. And there has to be smart collaboration. There are all kinds of people out there in the world, from Tourism Declares a Climate Emergency to other organizations who are gathering together, the Future of Tourism Coalition. There is a lot of expertise out there in the third sector and the private sector that's good at getting the numbers. We need to find a way of aggregating all of those, rolling them up to a national level, because it's the national climate goals which are going to be talked about at COP26. So that's the challenge. It's carbon, it's a national level. Over to you. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Fairhurst. This is a good plea for having tourism on the top of the policy agenda, generating jobs being important for the economy. I really like the statement that you do things and we have to learn from the good things and skip the things that didn't was a success. I think that's the way to make progress. And your example of carbon is very fit, and it's also an area where maybe we can harmonize things well, because there's common pricing and measurement can be compared. So again, there's a stress that we need good data to make policies possible, to have the right discussion. If tourism is so important, we need the right data on the economic impact, on the jobs, on the environmental impact. So thank you for these insights. And to all the four panelists, I would say thank you for sticking so perfectly to time. You make my job as a chair incredibly easy. So thanks for that. At the Q&A at the end, we'll have some time to take questions, but I think the message of all four of you is very clear. We need a reset for tourism. We need to do it in a sustainable way. We need good data. We need standards to be able to well-defined data, comparable data, well, we work together on that. So the next block will take us into 4 country experiences, countries that have experience in measuring this sustainability of tourism. So we hear a bit more in depth what they have been done, and please tell what has been successful, but also what has been failures, because that's, as Mr. Ferris said, the way to learn. So the first one I'm going to give the floor is Miss Carol Coy. She's Director General of Statistical Institutes of Jamaica, also Chief Statistician of Jamaica. Obviously, tourism is important for Jamaica, so we're looking forward to her speech. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thanks. And I need to thank the Hernan and the UNWTO for inviting Statin, which is the National Statistics Office in Jamaica, to, I'm trying to share my screen, to do this presentation as to what is happening in Jamaica with regards to measuring sustainable tourism. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Just a background on Jamaica. As you know, we are a small island in the Caribbean, and we are described as one of the small island developing states, and we share a number of characteristics of this group. Low-lying development centered along the coast. We are particularly vulnerable. We are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Jamaica is in the tropics. We are seasonally affected by extreme weather conditions such as hurricanes and climates. And I think most persons would have been aware in about the last 2 to 3 years, the destructive hurricanes that have moved through the Caribbean. Jamaica was, we were not affected, so that was an advantage for us. And so issues like climate variability are critical, and they impact countries like ours, where you either have flooding or drought. And what this is a threat to settlement, infrastructure, and the economy. So those are characteristics of Jamaica. We depend quite heavily on tourism. So given that issue where we are affected by climate, what you find is tourism in 2019, tourism share of GDP in Jamaica was 9.8%. I seem to be going back my previous slide, sorry. Inbound tourism expenditure was actually 60% of, it represented 60% of Jamaica's total exports. So it's an important foreign exchange earner for Jamaica. In 2019, the tourism industries represented 13% of the total employed labor force. And that was in July 2019. By July 2020, however, there was a 24.2% decline in the employed labor force in tourism. And obviously this would be because of the impact of COVID. So COVID significantly impacted the tourism industry in Jamaica. What are the existing data that we have in Jamaica? The usual inbound arrivals, expenditure, both inbound and domestic, occupancy levels. Jamaica does a tourism satellite account, so we can provide information on tourism direct GDP, tourism industry value added, and employment in tourism. And so most of these, you would have realized, they're mainly economic data. And for us, the information is based using the international recommendations for tourism, the Tourism Satellite Accounts Recommended Methodological Framework, and the UN system of national accounts. We can also provide data on SDG indicator 8.9.1, tourism direct GDP as a proportion of total GDP, and the growth rate. Now, the issue of the development of the measurement framework for sustainable tourism. There is limited information in Jamaica on sustainable tourism. And I think that is a reality for most of the Caribbean. The Ministry of Tourism, however, is leading the development to have the measure of sustainable tourism. They have actually developed a draft concept paper on the development of measurement of tourism, sustainable tourism. And it's based on a review of the existing international recommendations on tourism indicators from the UNWTO, the Caribbean Tourism Organization, OECD, and Eurostat. So they have been looking at what is out there, what is being developed, and try to develop this concept paper for sustainable tourism. And the reason why are they doing this? Obviously, given the importance of tourism to Jamaica, we need to measure tourism's role in sustainable development. We need to see the impacts of the environment on tourism, climate change on tourism, but we also need to look at how tourism is impacting the economic, social, and environment structure in Jamaica. There's also the need to expand the current statistics beyond economics to include environmental and sociocultural issues. There's also the importance of integrating with the policy direction of the UNWTO's MST framework to improve data collection in tourism sector, to develop and monitor a more robust tourism policy. And so this is a critical part of their efforts, is to ensure that the policies that are being developed are sustainable and to align with the SDGs. Now, what are the main policy issues being addressed when the ministry is thinking of developing this? As I mentioned and I alluded to earlier, tourism dependence on the environment. So if the tourists are coming to Jamaica, a significant portion of our tourists are looking at the sand, the beach. They're also moving into ecotourism. Then we need to have beaches, healthy reefs, clean water or forests. And as I said before, Jamaica, like other small island developing states, are being impacted by climate change. We need to also look at the environmental impacts, the disruption to ecosystem and biodiversity. We need to look at water quality, waste management, energy consumption, greenhouse gas emissions, the perception and response of the sector. So the instituting environmental protection taxes, looking at the environmental protection expenditure, the social impacts, the employment, pension benefits, housing, local housing. And the issue for us, a feature of Jamaica, is wherever economic development is taking place, you tend to have the development of what we call informal squatter settlements, because persons move to where jobs are, but are we providing that type of housing to ensure that the persons are living in decent conditions? The impact on your local traditions and customs. What is the impact of tourism on our roads, our hospitals, and our sewage systems? Countries like Jamaica that face fiscal constraints, expenditure on roads and hospitals and sewage systems sometimes do not keep pace with economic development. And so these are issues that we have to look at. So why do we have to look at these tourism indicators? These indicators have to present a comprehensive system for identifying the potential risks and the possible actions that can be taken. And so each country has to, within that guideline, look at those indicators that best fit its concerns. And so for the ministry and Jamaica on a whole, it's to develop indicators that measure the change in internal factors and the structure of tourism. We also need to look at the change in external factors that impact tourism. And we have been talking about COVID-19. COVID-19 had a significant impact on the Jamaican economy. So in the third quarter, for example, the economy declined by 10.7%. In the second quarter, it declined by 18.3%. And the big industries, the industries that impacted it significantly, where if you were to look at the hotel and restaurants industry in Jamaica, it declined by 85.6% in the second quarter and 65.2% in the third quarter. So we have to be aware of what are the external factors that impact tourism. And importantly, the impacts caused by tourism. And this is where it is important for us to look at especially the environmental impact of tourism. So for us in Jamaica, some of the possible tourism indicators in the economic dimension, which I think is already covered, employment, although issues such as decent work, we will have to look at. And as the National Statistics Office in Jamaica, we will be moving to measuring decent work in about 2023. Visitor expenditure, which we look at, contribution to GDP, labor productivity, length of stay. On the environmental dimension, we're looking at things like water consumption, energy consumption, renewable sources of energy, solid waste, recycling initiatives, water quality, protective areas. And in the socio-cultural dimension, we're looking at inclusiveness, how the impact of tourism through the Jamaican economy. There's always been this view that tourism, the economic impact of tourism does not flow through most of the other sectors in the economy. So data would have to be provided for us to can measure this and see how impactful or the multiplier effect of tourism on the rest of the economy. Housing, as I said before, social benefits and pensions, and decent work. Now, what are some of the challenges that as the National Statistics Office we see in developing sustainable tourism indicators? In Jamaica, environment statistics is limited. When you compare to say data on economic and social statistics, this is also reflected in our able to monitor the sustainable development indicators. The environment indicators are one of those that are giving us problems. Jamaica also has not started the development of the Environment Economic Accounting, the SEER. It is on our work program, but as with any developing country, you have resource constraints. And so what you tend to do is give priority to statistics that your stakeholders are pressuring you to provide. But we see the importance of doing this. We have been participating in the UN workshops and discussions regarding the development of SEER. Another area that we see that is going to be very difficult is to disaggregate data to isolate tourism sector. So for example, the impact of CO2, which was mentioned. We have data on CO2 by industry, but the tourism is not one of that. And the difficulty, which I think came while we were doing, is the same issue you have with the TSA. It's that tourism is not an industry as classified in ISIC. And so the issue is isolating, for example, out of restaurants and the restaurant industry, what portion of this is due to tourism? And so we are going to need technical assistance heavily in trying to disaggregate environmental data to isolate that impact of tourism. So we might be able to say, what's the impact, what is happening to our forests, what is happening to our beaches, but what is the impact of tourism on that? We see this as going to be a major challenge for us. And we have an underdeveloped national statistics system, and this presents a challenge for coordination. So a number of the data that we would use would be generated by a number of ministries and departments and agencies, and is to coordinate with these persons. And so for us, working with the Ministry of Tourism is going to be critical in getting these, in coordinating this type of information. So for us, the next steps is engagement with critical stakeholders. And the Ministry of Tourism has started this. So we have had I'm speaking from the National Statistics Office perspective. We have had this discussion, and the discussion now is to engage the other public sector agencies and academia and private sector into developing this type of statistics. To establish a technical working group, because this will be required to provide oversight to the development. We will need to identify the existing data gaps and develop a program for data collection. And a critical part of it is to identify the resources, because speaking from the National Statistics Office, we might have all the goodwill in the world and we set up a program, but if the resources are not there, then what happens is that the program gets lost. Engage the UNWTO to provide technical assistance, and we are going to need wide stakeholder involvement in the buying in the process, especially the private sector members of the tourism industries. And for me, that is the status in Jamaica regarding tourism sustainability measurement. Thanks.
Thank you, Mrs. Goy, for this very well-structured overview of the situation in Jamaica. Thanks for telling what is most interesting now, the dependencies on the environment, the impact on the environment, taxes, expenditures, the social impact, impact on infrastructure. This makes it very concrete for all the people listening now, what you are interested in, and also what you use it for, the risk and the actions you can take, changes internally, externally. I think I would personally completely agree that you put your money and your efforts where there's the interest of the stakeholders, what they ask you to do. I mean, that's obviously most important. And I think also the challenges are familiar to many countries. So thanks for sharing the next steps, what you're going to do. And hopefully, we can help from the UN community and the UNWTO to implement and to help. So thanks for this very well structured insights. The next presenter is Mr. Julio Santaella, President from the National Institute for Statistics and Geography in Mexico. Julio, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bert. It's a pleasure to be here with you talking about sustainable tourism. I want to thank the invitation from UNWTO to participate in this side event, particularly from Hernan Epstein and Clara Vanden Pol. I'm going to start to share my screen so you can see my presentation. I think we should all have an agreement about the importance of measuring sustainability. The previous speakers have made that very clear. That was basically the first part of my presentation. The second part is probably more original. I want to talk about a case study or a pilot that we're actually engaging in Mexico in order to try to see how much progress can we make in measuring sustainable tourism. So let me go on into some of the topics. The previous speakers, especially my tocayo from Spain, Julio, was also talking about the importance of tourism in the economy and in social issues in Spain particularly, but we also heard that in Cabo Verde and Jamaica. In the case of Mexico, tourism accounts for between 8 to 9% of GDP. Tourism creates more than 2 million jobs in Mexico. That's about 5% of total job creation. So it's really a very important economic activity. And of course, the whole idea of moving into sustainability is that tourism should be healthy in a way that it's environmentally friendly, it's socially responsible or inclusive, and it can also generate spillovers to the local economy, no? And that's why this Manila Declaration was very important. It was a starting point to develop a statistical framework for measuring sustainability of tourism, no? And of course, the idea is to identify positive and negative impacts arising from tourism, particularly on two dimensions beyond the economic side, on the environment, such as natural resources, and as well on cultural and other intangible elements of society. And last but not least, it should also be very useful in compiling and measuring some of the indicators related to goals 8.9 and 12.B. Carol, my colleague from Jamaica, already said what indicator 8.9.1 is, and 2.B is implementing these accounting standards in order to measure the impacts of tourism. No? Now, one important advantage from Mexico is that we have a well-developed system of satellite accounts for the system of national accounts. In particular, we have a couple of them that apply to the current topic. We have a tourism satellite account, and for some years, we have already developed environmentally and economic accounts based on the central framework of SIA in the case of Mexico. So what we're trying to do in this pilot is to look at the intersection of these two different satellite accounts and focusing more precisely on the aspect of nature tourism and adventure tourism, where we have certain elements that are applied to both ideas. I mean, we can have a look at the environmental impact and of course have an economic valuation of the activities that are going on. No? So this approach is trying to capture the effects of tourism on the depletion and degradation of natural assets and the ecosystem, as well as the positive impact that some friendly actions could have tourist industry on the environment. Now, to elaborate a little bit about the conceptual approach, first we want to try to measure the economy of what we call nature tourism. And by that, we mean a set of tourism activities that are well regulated in environmentally protected places where tourism basically has zero or minimal environmental impact. And then we want to identify positive and negative impacts of tourism. Ones could be positive externalities generated by tourism, such as when we have pollution control or waste control, or we're using clean energy, or there are elements of sustainable consumption and clean and circular economy type of activities. And on the other side, also, we have negative externalities that could come on the environment arising from tourist activities, such as wastewater discharge, inappropriate waste disposal, unclean energy consumption, and pollution. So those are basically the main elements that we are trying to identify. Now, with that framework in mind, I want to talk about the progress that Mexico is doing on measuring sustainable tourism. So the idea is to explore this methodology, identifying areas of influence to measure this framework at the subnational level. So the procedure is the following. First, we have to identify these areas or sites where regulated tourism is taking place. And we have focused on what we call in Mexico natural protected areas, which are designated by the government to have a special status of the protection for the environment. Then, with the help of our geospatial dimension in INEGI, we're using the digital map of Mexico in order to identify the natural protected areas and the touristic establishments in order to make a merge and find where these two different dominions intersect. And after that, we are going to define a buffer zone around these natural protected areas in order to define the area of influence where this is going to happen. Now, once we have the geography defined, we're going to take a look into what economic activity is happening there using information from our economic censuses and the tourism satellite account, and then try to derivate or calculate some different variables, both from the economic point of view, such as income, value added, employment, but also try to extend into the environment impacts of these activities. So this small map of Mexico shows in green all the natural protected areas in our country. You see high areas arising in the ocean. Now we're going to focus on the Caribbean, where we share areas with Jamaica. But now we're going to identify where different tourist establishments happen in Mexico. You see that many are outside the national protected areas. So we want to make an intersection of these two for a specific area. And we have chosen this area in the Caribbean, where a small island called Cozumel is located. And in there, we have in dark green the natural protected area, and in light green the buffer zone that we have selected, and with in pink the basic areas where tourism is happening in the town of Cozumel and surrounding areas in itself. Now, within that buffer zone, we have identified the different tourism establishments. So we can count by the type of economic activity, 1,300, a little bit more of tourism activity or establishments that are taking place around this area. And these kind of establishments comprise travel agencies, hotels, with or without integrated services. We have also type of restaurants, canteens, bars, nightclubs, and the like, and other types of establishments that could be related to this tourism activity. Now, with those establishments, preliminary calculations have identified what's the gross value added that economic activity is actually creating in this buffer zone that we have identified around a natural protected area of interest. The idea is that we can measure regulated, sustainable, and protected nature tourism that generates economic resources. And an additional element that is very important for us is that we have, in this case, a complementary study where we have taken part with German Federal Ministry of the Environment and the German International Cooperation Agency, GIZ or HIS, in order to select particular ecosystem services and then evaluate them. So we selected, for instance, the recreation activity, the ecosystem services provided by mangroves and coastal protection, and have measured the impacts. So for instance, we measure the impact of reefs, healthy reefs, and have made a calculation that the health of the reefs is lost in Cozumel. We would be losing 12% of visitors in a particular period. We also identify how mangroves provide ecosystem services that are fundamental for the island, such as Carol mentioned in the Pacific. The mangroves provide food provision, recreation, coastal protection. They help for CO2 sequestration, and they're beautiful in terms of the scenery. And coastal protection is also very important because, as in other islands in the Caribbean, it helps to protect the population. In this case, we calculate that 65% of the population is vulnerable to flooding and climatic events. So that's part of the thing that we could incorporate into the economic calculation and make the point that it's worth investing in the protection of the environment, complementing the sustainability tourism measurement. So let me conclude that saying that it is possible to advance in the measurement of sustainable tourism by linking statistical and geospatial information. In this case, we use the same platform where we combine the digital map of Mexico, national accounts, our satellite accounts, census, and ecosystem calculation, ecosystem services calculation. However, it's complicated in the sense that we need the coordination of many different institutions at the national level. In the case of Mexico, not only the National Statistical and Geographical Agency, INEGI, but also the National Commission for National Protected Areas, CONAM, the Ministry of Tourism sector, and other institutions from the environment domain. Of course, I already said this eventually may help to contribute to monitor different goals. We already measure indicator 8.9.1, but we have to make progress in 12.b. And of course, we need standards internationally agreed in order to move forward into further progress into implementing this statistical framework for measuring sustainable tourism. Thank you.
Thank you, Julio, for this impressive presentation. It's so good to see that you already have an infrastructure in place to start from, where you can do so much. So good tourism statistics, SIA statistics in production, evaluation of ecosystem accounting. But I'm also jealous that you have this geospatial part of your office too, because it really takes cooperation between statisticians and geospatial people to make these things visible on a geospatial scale, because many of these things are in areas, and so it's very good to be able to combine that in your studies. So thanks for these insights. The next speaker is Vivian Larina. She's currently the Assistant National Statistician from the Philippine Statistics Authority, and among other things responsible for satellite accounts on tourism. So Vivian, can I give you the floor?
Thank you very much, Mr. Bert.
It works.
Allow me to share to you the experience of the Philippines in developing measures of sustainable tourism. So I would like to start on trying to mention the initiatives of the Philippines to develop the tourism satellite accounts. As we all know, we are taking off from the tourism satellite accounts before we go into measuring the sustainable tourism. And then moving on to the scope, what we have done in the Philippines, what are the data and data sources, and briefly the methodologies. And I will also mention something about the results that we have and some ways forward. For the Philippines, the tourism plays a very significant role in the economy. As we know, in 2019, for example, tourism contributed 12.7%. And next slide, please. And then it contributed for out of the 6.9% GDP growth in 2019, it contributed 1.32 percentage points. So this is like the second next to trade of the different industries classification under the ISIC. And when we look at the total exports, inbound tourism expenditure contributed 8.6% to our economy. And also the tourism employment, it shared 13.5% to the total employment. So these are some of the indicators that will show us how significant the tourism in the Philippine economy. Now let's move on some of the initiative. First, in developing the tourism satellite accounts. So in the Philippines, we started the tourism satellite accounts as a research study to find out whether is it feasible to do satellite accounts given the available data, but there was huge demand for tourism statistics and tourism indicator for the planning. And also after several years, we say that the Philippine Statistics Authority or the statistical office cannot do it alone. So we created an interagency committee to develop the satellite accounts on tourism. And it was like after 11 years when we have finally compiled the estimates for the tourism satellite accounts. And this is starting with 2 years for 1994 and 1998. Then after that, we developed the methodologies based, of course, on the framework of the UNWTO. And this is the Philippine version of the operational methodology. And also we started developing the version of the Philippines in terms of classifying all these tourism activities and also classifying the tourism products and services. And we asked the statistical board to approve them for the adoption of all the agencies or stakeholders within the government. And very recently, in 2020, we tried to look at the time series that we have, and we aligned them in the system of national accounts. So we started institutionalizing the compilation of tourism accounts 2011. Now, moving on in measuring the sustainable tourism, we started this in June of 2017. As we are all aware, we have the Manila Call for Action on Measuring Sustainable Tourism, and that time everybody is into tourism, and a lot of stakeholders are also very keen on they are keen on trying to measure the sustainable tourism. And this is a concept that until now in the Philippines, that this has yet to be discussed and yet to be advocated to our stakeholders. How sustainable are the tourism industry? So these are some of the questions that we have been discussing, and yet we tried to proceed, continue, develop the data, look at the data, the available data, and find out what are really the priorities in terms of the tourism industries. So we started with looking at the energy consumption of tourism, also the water consumption of tourism, and this is done jointly by the Philippine Statistics Authority and also the Department of Tourism. And after a year, then we look at the carbon dioxide emission. And parallel to that, we are also trying to develop the compilers and data producers of measuring MST. And we train them, we train those people that are doing or generating the data for tourism, those past agencies that are generating data for measuring sustainable tourism. And as much as we can, we leverage on our interagency Committee on Tourism Statistics. We do update them, provide presentations. This is a committee that is composed of several agencies, planning agencies, tourism agencies, statistical agencies, the private and also the academe. And in every forum, statistical forum, we try to popularize the MST in the Convention of Statistics and also in important fora. And also we contributed to the publication of the UNWTO. Next, as mentioned, we look at the energy consumption, water consumption, and carbon dioxide emission. And we are trying to link this with a system of environment and economic accounts. We have developed energy accounts under the SIA and also the water accounts under the SIA. And now we are moving towards linking them. In terms of the data, most of this data for tourism satellite accounts and measuring sustainability of tourism are coming from the Philippine Statistics Authority. Of course, we are the compiler of the tourism satellite accounts. We also compile the national accounts, and we have the regular survey of the household survey of domestic tourism and the regular survey for tourism establishments, the labor force surveys, and also our partners from the Department of Energy and most especially the Department of Tourism in terms of data for visitor arrivals, length of stay, and the distribution of regional travelers. So we started first with energy consumption, and we look at the petroleum and other fuel products consumption by tourists and also the electricity consumption. Then we proceeded with the water consumption and then the emissions of the carbon dioxide. And this is due to petroleum emission of carbon dioxide due to petroleum usage and electricity. Now on the results, these are just very preliminary. There are a lot of things yet to be improved. But initially, what we have done is, for example, for water, when we compare that water consumption of domestic tourists to the total consumption of the internal tourists, internal meaning the inbound tourists and the domestic tourists, then the total consumption is like 73.6%. Well, this is understandable because in the tourism satellite accounts, the domestic tourism is constituting 85% of the total gross value added. And then in terms of the transport services, these are the transport services availed of and we compare that to the energy consumption of all the tourists, and this is constituting 78.8%. Now, in terms of the total tourist consumption of petroleum and other fuel products, including electricity, when we compare them to the total economy's emission of carbon dioxide, this is 32.4%. So these are just indicators that somehow it can provide us how tourists consume and the emission of tourists due to electricity and petroleum. Similarly, for electricity, this is 37.2%. Okay. As I mentioned earlier, this is still very developmental, and we wanted to pursue on of course, we are awaiting for the framework to be developed and to be endorsed and finalized. But for the meantime, we continue to train within the statistical office and even our partners from the Department of Tourism in terms of trying to understand what are the data that has to provide inputs to be generated for MST, for tourism satellite accounts, and also to regularly do advocacy programs or activities, most especially to the users, to the data producers, and possibly later we can institutionalize the compilation of the MST. Once a consensus of the community of the statistics and tourism agencies we can establish. And then we will try to expand the estimates to have an indicator for measuring sustainable tourism, and also to include also the dissemination forum, possibly to the different stakeholders in the country. Thank you very much. That's our contribution to the MST.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this very clear presentation on what has been done in the Philippines. It's obvious that tourism is also very important for the Philippines, also in economic terms, and I can understand that the relation between nature, energy, water consumption, carbon dioxide are very important. It's good to see that you're able to use the existing SIA framework, so thanks for sharing all this information. The last speaker on this part of the program has been a change from the program. Mr. Peter Leimer has some personal circumstances and cannot join us today, but we found Mr. Jürgen Weiss from Statistics Austria ready to take his place on very last minute. So thank you for doing that, Jürgen. Mr. Weiss is head of the tourism unit and will describe the situation in Austria.
Yep.
The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I will try to share my screen with you. And I'm very pleased to present you tourism in Austria on behalf of Peter Leimer, as I said before. Well, my name is Jürgen Weiss. I'm head of tourism statistics at Statistics Austria. So, do you see still the first slide?
Yes. Now the second.
Okay, now it's working. The outline for this short presentation, after some preliminaries, I want to focus on the Austrian Master Plan for Tourism, and to add sustainability in indicators. And finally, some reflections on the Tourism Report 2019, where, as statisticians have by nature to do, I will give you some facts and figures. So, of course, not to mention, the ongoing pandemic has changed a lot. However, sustainability was a major topic before the crisis, and will be even more when tourism industry is starting to recover. The aim is to establish a coherent measurement system through a statistical approach where the needs of all stakeholders involved are considered. So the master plan for tourism. What is meant by this headline, master plan for tourism? In a nutshell, it is the expressed political will of how Austrian tourism has to be set up to challenge economic, ecological, and also social developments in the near future. And that is the key point of statistical work, of course, how to make these achievements measurable and therefore also visible. Okay, so tourism leaves obvious footprints, and these footprints have been for a long time the only basis to measure the success of tourism by physical indicators. These footprints can be translated in statistical variables we all know, such as the number of arrivals, the number of overnights, the amount of expenditure. However, the aim was to go beyond these physical indicators and to create a more holistic picture of measuring tourism. It is the need to include the ecological and social dimensions of tourism and also more in-depth economic reflections. That was the main outcome of the tourism master plan. So you see here on these pictures some of these indicators, which was the outcome of very in-depth discussions. By proposing more than 100 indicators, a set of final indicators you can see here was selected by experts in the end. Yeah? The set reflects a common denominator of pragmatism, of comprehensive information, and also of cost efficiency. These indicators try to meet the needs of measuring tourism along the three pillars of sustainability. In the center of these indicators, the tourism satellite account reflects the economic dimension, the value added by tourism industry and the effects on employment are most recognized figures. It is clearly to state that tourism is not only accommodation and transport industry, but also comprises other forms of tourism, such as same-day visits, for instance, and also economic effects that spread out into almost all single branches of the different economic sectors. Tourism is not only an economic sphere, it takes place in our environment, and it is a major factor of production. And our biggest asset in this context is our nature. So it is also to emphasize that the environmental dimensions of tourism and how they can be measured in an integrated way have to be taken into account. An important data source, for instance, energy accounts, giving information about supply and use of energy commodities and the share of renewable energy use. The complexity of tourism, however, confines the significance as only main tourism industries, such as accommodation, food serving services, and transport services are taken into account. Tourism, of course, is also enriched by cultural heritage. Tourism consumption and production takes place within our societies and therefore affects us directly as a society. So the guiding question for the socio-cultural dimensions is therefore, what impact does tourism have on our society? One approach to measure that impact is that information on guest satisfaction should complement economic indicators. These indicators are collected since years by the Austrian Tourism Board, and they fit well in the holistic picture of tourism sustainability measurement. Also, and very important in times of over-tourism, which were in the year 2019 and maybe will come in the next years back again, is the question how accepted is tourism and how accepted are the external effects caused by tourism by the local population. This question led to the indicator of tourism acceptance, which is surveyed in a panel design by the Ministry of Tourism. Well, nevertheless, the so-called, or I call it that way, the dinosaurs of tourism statistics do still have big relevance and are also taken still into account, especially when comparing competitiveness among destinations and developments over time and on small granularity level. Indicators such as arrivals and night spans, overnights by federal states, duration of stay, overnights by country of origin, development of market share in Europe, and many more are very useful for describing a whole tourism picture. So all these indicators are not theoretical reflections, but since a few years, they are regularly published in an annual report, which was also presented to the Tourism Committee of the Austrian Parliament. And this report takes into account economic, socio-cultural and ecological dimensions, trying to fill these dimensions with as many statistical information as possible and useful. So I will finally give you some facts from the world before the crisis started, the year 2019. And I think these data can also be seen as a benchmark for recovery. Maybe starting with the most important economic fact, the contribution to the GDP of tourism was 7.3% in Austria. From an ecological point of view, tourism accounted for 1% of the final energy consumption, whereas the share of renewable energy was almost the half. The local population widely accepts tourism as the perception index amounted to 78 points on a scale from 0 to 100. It will be very interesting to compare these 78 points to the next survey, which takes place right after the crisis. As you can see here, there are a lot of indicators, and I will pick out some other highlights maybe of this report. So maybe the per capita income of tourism is more than $2,000 a year. Contribution to GDP, as mentioned before, is 7.3%. More than 200,000 people find jobs only in accommodation and restaurant section. The population of Austria, by the way, is 8 million. At the same time, 25 kilowatt hours energy is used by one overnight guest. So this is also an information which is not an economic information, but adds an ecological point of view. Another question is tourism accepted? The figures say yes. The guest satisfaction is quite positive. And as we heard before, 78% or the rate of acceptance of tourism is 78. I will now come to the conclusion of this short presentation. The report from 2019 can be seen as a benchmark. It is up to measure how tourism develops after the crisis, not only in economic terms, but also in social and ecological criteria and development indicators. I think in Austria, the basis with the master plan for tourism is set. The figures collected and being analyzed in future will bring more clarity. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for this presentation and for filling in at the last moment for your colleague. It's very interesting to hear about this master plan, and it's also good to see such concrete proposals for the social-cultural dimension. That was one of the questions in the chat. How can you measure that? And you gave some concrete answers to that. So thank you. We're moving to the last part of today's agenda, and that's the introduction, or maybe it doesn't need to be introduced, but some explanation about the statistical framework for measuring the sustainability of tourism. And this will be a joint presentation by Mr. Hernan Epstein, Chief of Statistics of WNTO, and Ms. Alessandra Priante, Regional Director for Europe of UNWTO. So I give the floor to you. I think Hernan first.
Thank you very much, Bert. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. This is a very, very interesting event. I'm very, very happy with all the presentations from all the countries. I think the discussion is very rich. I also see some very interesting questions in the Q&A box. What I will do is I will try to briefly, this has been mentioned already several times during the event, this framework for measuring the sustainability of tourism. We call it MST. So I'll be saying MST a lot during my presentation. So what I will do is try to give a little bit of an overview of what it is. I don't want to take too much time. So the MST project is a project that UNWTO has been carrying jointly with UNSD and a number of countries and organizations for some years now. It has three main pillars in which we work, and these three pillars are interconnected. The first pillar is the standard, is creating this what we call the statistical framework for measuring the sustainability of tourism. As you probably know, there are two standards right now in tourism international statistics. These are the tourism recommendations for tourism statistics and the tourism satellite account recommended framework. The idea, the aim of this new framework is that to become the third standard in tourism and to expand the measurement beyond the economic dimension to the three different dimensions of sustainability, which I will touch upon later on. A second pillar of work is implementation. So in here, the development of the standard is relatively advanced. So some countries have already started implementing the framework and measuring the sustainability of tourism. As you've seen some examples already. Then also we're trying to develop ways to create capacity development programs and to provide technical support to countries as well. And finally, the last pillar is on data. You've seen some data collected by some of the countries today, so I'm not going to go into much detail with that. An important part of putting a standard forward in statistics is consensus building. I think we can all agree on that. UNWTO has, I see Bert smiling, yes. So in UNWTO, we've been working together with many different entities or groups within the statistical community, but also within the tourism community. The UNWTO General Assembly, the UN Statistical Commission, the G20 as well, both Mexico and the presentations from Julio from Mexico and Vivian from Filipinas also mentioned the Manila Call for Action. The way that we also create and we organize the work around the MST framework is through a working group of experts on measuring the sustainability of tourism. And this is also a very wide net that includes lots of countries that we see there. You can see a list of the 28 countries that are part of the MST group of experts. UNSD, ILO, many international organizations are part of this working group as well. Academia, the private sector, also an important part of this group. So this is also a lot of work that makes this process inclusive and allows for consensus building. The final and ultimately the goal of this framework will be to be presented in front of the UN Statistical Commission and for it to be approved or recognized as an international standard. Now, for this, we need for the standard to be technically very sound and also for the consensus to be solid. In terms of the framework itself, I'll briefly touch upon, of course, I don't have much time to go into big detail, but the framework focuses on the three main dimensions of sustainability: the economic, the social, and environmental. It looks at these three dimensions in a nested way, as you can see on the chart. Some of the areas of measurement within the economic dimension, for example, are GDP, establishments, which is a way to, for example, to analyze the demography of the sector, employment, visitor expenditure, investment. This is also an issue that has been mentioned today by some of the presentations. In the social area, social dimension, some areas of measurement are decent work, also has been mentioned today. Education, health, there was also a question regarding this. Health is, of course, now more important than ever, and have indicators on relating health to tourism as well. Culture, visitor perception. And finally, on the environmental dimension, we have water use, energy use, waste and waste generation and emissions, land, protected areas, as is one of the areas of work in which Mexico showed today, ecosystems, biodiversity, etc. So how is the framework formed? It borrows from other statistical tools and accounting frameworks that are already in place, the TSA, the tourism satellite accounts, of course, the system of environmental and economic accounting environmental and economic accounts on the environmental side, and of course some other tools from the social areas, such as social capital or human capital. What it does is borrows some of the main concepts and definitions from these tools, and it puts them together, links them up to be applied to the area to the sector of tourism. I saw that one of the questions was asking whether we need SIA to be able to implement the MST. Well, first of all, the MST is wider than the environmental. It also includes the social side. So in that sense, it's not necessary for example, the social side. But also the MST, what it does is it allows to implement it in a modular approach. Because it's a very wide frame, so it can be implemented in different parts of the frame can be implemented. And I don't think it's necessary to have the SIA available to be able to implement the MST, because one can borrow the main concepts from the SIA in order to link them up to the TSA, for example, or to the tourism concepts. Of course, having a SIA would be much more, it would facilitate the compilation of some of the areas in the MST. Yeah, so I think of course you would need some to focus on the environmental side. You would need some data coming from the environmental perspective, of course. And finally, an important issue on sustainability is going below the national level. And of course, sustainability is important to measure at the subnational level. So the MST accounts for this as well. And it does so, that the MST has a specific chapter that takes into account the subnational level of measurement. To end, and then I'll pass the floor to my colleague Alessandra, just some information on the data and the implementation of the MST. So far we have, I mentioned there were some pilots that have been implementing the framework or parts of the framework. So you can see here the list, 13 different countries. We recently made a publication on these experiences from countries with some of the main data that was published by them. You can access it at the link at the bottom. We will share the presentations later on. And also an important issue, I think also many of the questions on the Q&A box were related to indicators. So of course, these frameworks can help to develop and derive indicators that can be used across different countries and across time to measure, for example, the contribution of tourism to the SDG agenda. And this is, I think, one of the main benefits of having such a tool. The MST can help derive indicators for the inclusion in the global framework as to how tourism contributes to the SDG agenda, and also can help derive a thematic set of indicators for the SDGs. So with this in mind, I'll stop here. I'll give Alessandra the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hernan, and mostly thank you very much for having invited me to join this fantastic set of speakers on such an important matter. I think that as we were discussing for many times, and as we also shared with all our member states, especially the one from Region Europe, it is indeed a certainty that not only statistics is one of the key driver, but the need for measurement of sustainability is beyond important, because any strategy and any policy that needs to make a difference for the future needs to embed instruments of measurement that would allow not only to have a quality approach, but also a quantity approach that would allow us as well to measure the improvement and the success that we have in actually matching these important objectives. And when I say objectives, I don't just particularly refer to our beloved SDGs in the framework of the Agenda 2030. I'm also talking about much larger level of objectives, but also very, very concrete and pragmatic ones that are the ones that mostly the authorities at a regional and local level, as much as a national level, are looking for. Sustainability has been for a very long time a word that has been added to strategic approaches, to proposals, as something that would just make things sound much nicer. But while we were in the midst of an unprecedented growth of tourism with a pace of 4% every year, with 1.5 billion international tourism arrivals being recorded at the end of 2019, nobody really cared, if you allow me with my usual frankness, what that really meant. And nobody really wanted to commit, aside very, virtuous examples, some of them are actually here with us, cared so much about or thought that this was going to become an issue sooner or later. COVID-19, this halt, which is bringing unprecedented economic effects, which we seriously hope are going to find some relief soon, has highlighted that sustainability, together with innovation, but mainly sustainability in its tripartite approach, has to be much more than that word. It has to become a way of life that rises from top to bottom and from bottom up. If you allow me, Hernan, I would also like to launch, beside advocating for such an incredible achievement on behalf of UNWTO, and making sure that everyone understands how important and fundamental this is, that there is a general consensus reached on the importance and the much needed approval of this MST framework. We all need to learn how to measure sustainable tourism. We all need to learn how to measure our impact as individuals, as much as tourism professionals, as policymakers, as much as family members. Tourism is a way of life. It's part of our life. We really hope that by restarting it, we can regain its, let's say, its absolute embedment into our being. But I think that sustainability has to have the same type of approach into our lives. We need to become sustainable ourselves. We need to measure what we do, and we need to be able to, this way, evaluate our contribution to the well-being of the world as much as of the people. Because let's not forget that what we're trying to do here is we're trying to give every policymaker at every level, every state, every stakeholder, and every technical person the empowerment to say that if this is not achieved, then maybe we've all lost a very good opportunity. COVID-19 is indeed the biggest crisis in the tourism sector, with a drop of 74% during the year of 2020, and 120 million direct tourism jobs lost, if not more. But it has to be an opportunity. And we firmly believe, not only in the European region, but I think as I can speak also as a citizen, that this specific effort is one of the tools to really turn it into an opportunity for everybody and for the whole world. Thank you very much, Hernan, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you for these very clear statements. I think a recurring theme is that although COVID has an enormous impact on tourism sector, and many jobs are lost and people are getting in problems now, it's an opportunity for a reset and to see how we can get tourism on a more sustainable basis after COVID. So it couldn't be more timely, this webinar, and it couldn't be more timely, this MST, and I think we should really work hard on it, given everything that we heard today. So we have 8 minutes left for the meeting today. This is not enough to answer all questions, but the organizers promised me that they'll put all the questions somewhere on the web and answer them. So everyone that has a question will get its answer, not in the plenary today, but later. But let me get a few questions out. And the first question I want to ask is to Mrs. Coy from Jamaica. The question you get in the Q&A is, well, you described everything you're doing in Jamaica, the challenges, the approaches. Is there any regional collaboration about these measures? How do countries help each other in the region, the CARICOM region? Maybe you can comment on that.
Okay, thanks. In the Caribbean, because of our size, we tend to work in regional bodies. So there is the CARICOM Statistics Division, and it has a work program for the region. And so it tends to guide and develop for the region statistics to measure so that the Caribbean. There's also the Caribbean Tourism Organization. And through this, the ministries and the tourism agencies work closely together. And from my presentation, you would have seen that in developing the concept paper for Jamaica, the Caribbean Tourism Organization would, its input would have been considered as part of this. So there is work on the statistics side, and on the ministry side, there are regional organizations that we work through.
Thank you. Thank you for your added information. Next question is for Julio from Mexico. We want to know more about the national versus the local impact of tourism. Where are the policy demands, and what are the challenges to making it spatially explicit? Can you comment on that?
Thank you for the question, Bert. We have experience at the national level, but as Hernan mentioned, the experience at the national level is at the satellite accounts, both at the environmental and economic accounts and the tourism account. But we have a long way to go at the subnational level. And that's where we believe that most of the sustainability has to be analyzed, because many of the ecosystem services are very different at the local level. So that's why we have focused on this pilot on that level. And of course, we have to escalate this exercise to the national level, but we're going to face quite a variety of services that are very different depending on the geography and the environment that we are trying to analyze. I think the examples of the Philippines and Austria focusing, for instance, on water use, energy use, CO2 emissions are a baseline upon which we have to build upon. And what we're trying to do mostly is to incorporate the valuation of biodiversity and ecosystem services provided, which are, we believe, quietly related to tourism. And that's where the policy should probably be focusing, at least at the forefront in many of our countries. Mexico, definitely one of them.
Thank you, Julio. All these answers give rise to a lot of additional questions and discussion, but we don't have the time for that. Sorry. Next question, I want to introduce Alessandra Alfieri from UNSD, very experienced in statistical standards in many areas, because we received some questions about the relation between national and local level in the measurements, and whether by applying the same indicators for regions with different characteristics, we not ignore the specific issues each destination has. Wouldn't the system of indicators tailored to the needs of the territory be appropriate? How important is a standard? So maybe you can reflect on that. Alessandra is Chief Environmental Economic Statistics at UNSD.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all this discussion, which I think was very rich. And I think Julio has touched really in his answer on the question. And what is the importance of having a reference framework or an agreed methodology, an agreed accounting framework that can help in developing this information and having it not only at the national level, but also spatially explicit, because especially in the case of tourism, it really matters where we are. So, and in this context, I think that the benefit of really having an accounting approach, which can be applied at different scales, is important in, first of all, in bringing all the institutions together, as was shown also in the case of the Philippines, but also in identifying for particular ecosystems, especially when we're talking about nature-based solution, what are the relevant indicators and what are the relevant measures that can be measured. And I think here, I mean, I would like to stress also what Vivian has mentioned, that no institution can do it on its own, but there is a need for having a framework, a system which will allow integrating all these different informations at different scales. And that's, I think that what MST is really trying to do is developing these building blocks that then can be put together and to develop the information that is coherent over time and a different geographical space. Thank you, Bert.
Thank you, Alessandra. I want to close the session by asking the four first speakers, so Tobias Thomas, Julio Lopez Astor, Pedro Moreira, and Tim Ferrist, a question, because you represent the different perspectives, policy, private sector, statistics. And basically we all heard today that it's important what we do. We need a reset of tourism in a sustainable way. There's clear vision that we need data and indicators, and we need to have them well described and comparable. So maybe all four of you can reflect what can we do more? What can the statistical community do more? What can the policy community do more? And what can international organizations, private sector do more? So what can we do, the different sectors to drive this whole agenda. So I'll start with Tobias Thomas. Can you reflect on that question?
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and thank you to all participants and to the statements made. I think this meeting we have today is actually a proof what can be done to bring the thing on the next level. So thank you very much to UNWTO. I think with such kind of meetings in our statistical worldwide community, we can really leverage the efforts to come to the measurement of the sustainability in tourism, so including all dimensions, environmental, social, and economic development. And I did very much like the country examples, for instance, of Carol, as well as Julio and Vivian. And so thank you. Let's continue this way together, and then I'm optimistic that we can achieve together big things. Thank you.
Great. That's an optimistic view. We love that. Mr. Julio Lopez Astor.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much once again for this opportunity for hosting this event. I think I've learned a lot of things in this couple of hours. I think someone asked if it's indicators, having good indicators enough. It's not enough. Obviously, it's just a part of the whole equation. You still have to drive the car. So it's still needed the will, the readiness to implement policies that are sustainable. But we do need the guidance that a good statistical framework can provide. And I am encouraged by this session. I think it's driving forward. And I've seen some good examples of what can be done with the limited resources available. And so I thank you once again for the opportunity.
Thank you. Mr. Pedro Moreira.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks everyone for this very important meeting, bringing together all kind of perspective and experience. And I believe that the most important thing is being together in this approach. Especially, I have to call you, especially people of the United Nations. We all know this, but it's not too much to say that small countries like Cabo Verde, for example, or the SIDS, for example, they always need special attention from major ones, from the United Nations, from UNWTO. So Cabo Verde counts on you guys, counts on UNWTO or the UN. And if we stick together, I'm sure we can get this done. Thank you very much, Bert.
Great. That's a recurring theme. We have to stick together. We have to work together. Statisticians, policymakers, researchers, private sector. Mr. Tim Fairhurst.
Hello, thank you, Chair. Coming from the private sector, this will be an odd thing to say, but this is one area where we just need to stop countries at a national level competing. Right? This is not about I got more tourists than you, they spent more money in my place than you. This is about making sure we've got space for this industry to function for the indefinite future. And at the moment, we do not have those metrics, and we have got to get the climate metric harmonization done rapidly. Otherwise, there will not be space for this industry to operate. It's as simple as that. It's urgent. We've got to get on with it. But thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute to the discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. Work together, even among companies. This is great. We're going to close to this event. I want to thank you all for attending, but especially the panelists for their interesting contribution. It's very important to drive this agenda forward. I think there's big support for this framework to further develop and to provide data that can be understood in a good way. Obviously, driving the interest of the policymakers, what do your stakeholders want? And as Tim said at the end, really do it together, work together, not competing with each other, but trying to drive this agenda together and make tourism sustainable and get the right data for that. So with this, we come to a close. We'll answer the questions on the website. There's a recording of the video, and well, thank you all, and we'll meet again. Goodbye.
Thank you.